Washington, D.C., and I also have the pleasure of representing the URJ on JCPA's board, so I'm thrilled to be here this afternoon with both of my hats on. I'm also thrilled to moderate this panel with two very distinguished and expert speakers who are going to help us synthesize some of the information that we've heard today, both all together in the big room and in our breakouts. I know that both our speakers are familiar to you, and if so, you know what a treat we're in for. And I was thinking about this in the context of the other big event besides this symposium that's happening in Manhattan today, which is, of course, the Tony Award ceremony a couple of miles up the street. And any good theater person knows you want to end with a really good number. So they're going to sing. It's going to be amazing. Before we get going, though, I just want to remind everybody we are live streaming on Facebook. So feel free to share that with friends who couldn't be with us this afternoon. Our panelists for this program are, of course, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, President of the Union for Reform Judaism, and J.J. Goldberg, who is Editor-at-Large of The Forward. And you have their bios. We have a limited amount of time. I don't want to take up too much introducing them. I will just say about Rabbi Jacobs, who has made, under his leadership and presidency of the URJ, one of the key pillars forging stronger ties with Israel, along with engaging the next generation and social justice, all of which, of course, come together in a big package that makes our community stronger. JJ is one of the deans of American Jewish journalism, having been with the Forward for many years now, and of course also having lived in Israel for many years, and brings his wonderfully exuberant perspective to our conversation. So we're going to have each of our speakers make a few minutes of opening remarks, and we'll engage in some conversation and open it up for questions. So with that, I will turn it over to Rabbi Jacobs, or to JJ, who will begin.
Okay, I'm going to stand up because I'm short. A couple of thoughts, some of which I brought with me and some of which I formulated while I was listening to the day. There was a reference, or a few references, to the Jews of May 67 and the Jews of June 67. The ones who mainly remember the terror, the vulnerability of May, of 3 weeks, and the ones who remember mainly the triumph of the Six-Day War. I would argue that what's happened is that many of us never noticed that we won the war. We remember May and the fact that it turned out Israel was not that vulnerable, that it won 67 handily the same way it won 50, 64, 48 wasn't handy, but it was a miracle. We don't notice that. We remember the vulnerability, despite the fact that for the rest of the world, what came across was the invulnerability. Question two, the war electrified, galvanized American Jews. It attached us to Israel more than ever before. I think it was essentially a portion of the Jewish community. I want to draw a context here, which is that for 20 years before 67, in the summer of 45, the American Jewish Congress formed an alliance with the NAACP to try and change laws that made it legal to exclude blacks and Jews from most housing, from most jobs, and from most schools. And over the next 20 years, the two communities really fought a battle state by state. In 64 was the Civil Rights Act, the triumph in Congress. 65 was the Voting Rights Act. The Jewish organizations, mainly ADL, Congress, and Committee, had become so strong, so much a part of the fabric of American power between 45 and 65 that, Johnson called a conference, a White House conference on civil rights after the passage of the law, and the chairman of the conference, quite naturally, was Morris Abram, the president of the American Jewish Committee. That's how it worked. In 67, the organizations that had acquired all of that clout began applying it to defending Israel. The galvanization was of a leadership, an involved core. And for much of the community, it became, they were no longer in the business of representing American Jews. They were in the business of defending Israel. And for the last 50 years, we have had less and less of a presence in Washington that speaks in the name of American Jews, for American Jews, about the things that concern American Jews, and mainly speaks about Israel. And I don't want to say we shouldn't be defending Israel. I do want to say that it's become the new Torah, the new Judaism. It used to be, if you kept kosher, you kept Shabbos, you were Jewish. Now it doesn't matter what you do on Saturday as long as you support Israel. 67-68 was not only the year of the Six-Day War, it was the year of the New York teachers' strike and the national public collapse of black Jewish loins. It was the year of the publication of Arthur Morse's While 6 Million Died, when suddenly Franklin Roosevelt was no longer the guy who defeated Hitler and saved the Jewish people. He was the guy who didn't. We know that story. That was a complete transformation of the Holocaust in the minds of American Jews. The message from then on was not, look at what happened there. We should never let the world be like that again. We must work with people everywhere to make sure that we have a world where that doesn't happen. Our consciousness became, you can't really trust other people because that's the way the world is. An utter transformation. So the transformations that happened to us, and of course it was the year that the Soviet Jewish community rose up, came out of its slumber. And the transformations that turned the Jewish community from a liberal, optimistic, outward-looking community into an inward-looking, suspicious, nationalistic community all happened in 67. The Six-Day War was at the center of it, but it wasn't the only one. And I don't know that it's a coincidence that the same 50 years that saw that transformation of the public face of the Jewish community also saw a transformation of the rest of the Jewish community in declining affiliation, increasing intermarriage, increasing apathy toward Jewish issues and toward Israel, because the public life of the Jewish community has little to do with the private lives of Jews.
Mid-sentence, I want to know where that was going, but we'll get back to that in a moment. First of all, what a great day. Thank you to JCPA and ARZA for putting this day together and inviting us into this rich conversation. We're probably going to all leave with more questions than we entered, and that is saying something. One personal note on 67. I actually had not been to Israel before the 67 war, but I celebrated a bar mitzvah towards the end of the 60s, and my parashah was Ki Teitzeh, which is all about the rules of war. And I remember writing the first draft of my bar mitzvah Dvar Torah from my rabbi, and I wanted to focus on two different wars. I wanted to talk about the Six-Day War and the Vietnam War. And my rabbi said, what else do you have in mind? So I think now I want to pull back and I want to just really address the question of what are some of the takeaways for us? Because there's nothing theoretical about the issues that this 50th anniversary raises for us. There are front and center issues screaming at us on a daily basis. The question is, looking around the room, many of us are a particular demographic. And how is it that we're going to address those issues in a way that, first of all, expresses the love and solidarity that I know we all feel for the state of Israel's continued existence? But I think that JJ is right. There has become not just a focus on Israel as the dominant rallying cry, but it's a particular kind of Israel advocacy. And I think that one of the things that we talk about in the Six-Day War aftermath is what do we do with issues of territory and coexistence, and those are front and center. I think there's also a whole set of issues that we sometimes put in a very soft category, and we call them pluralism. We call them the Jewish democratic issues. And I think listening to Dani Dayan and our panelists earlier in the day, in Ilan Zerafi, it's clear that, frankly, there's no dancing around Jerusalem. There's no dancing around the place of the Kotel. There's no dancing around, frankly, the West Bank. And I know that we're told over and over again that Israel's existence is clearly this thing that's supposed to galvanize us. I think a lot of young Jews in particular are told not to bring all their core Jewish values to the Israel question. That the existential, physical threats are so grave that we have to actually be willing to, fudge on some of the Jewish democracy issues. And I think that is catastrophic for not only Jewish identity, but for the health and well-being of our North American Jewish community, and frankly, for the U.S.-Israel relationship. One of the things we're witnessing in our community is the erosion, if not the end, of the bipartisan support for the state of Israel. We're also seeing an enormous set of questions being raised, particularly by the younger generation. We talked earlier, it was mentioned, some of the different diversity in how people relate to Israel, and there's still a challenge to expand the conversation. I go to J Street, I give one talk, I give the same talk if I'm invited as I have been to APAC. How is it that we formulate views about Israel, issues of a shared society, issues of two states for two peoples, questions of Jerusalem? And, we have these internal conversations that actually affect policy. So I'll just use one. Ambassador David Friedman was nominated, obviously, early on to be the ambassador to Israel. I know that the reform movement was pretty quick and pretty loud. I think thoughtful about not just the question of whether he is or is not the right person, but what are the issues that are front and center for the U.S. in particular. And one of the things that I met with Ambassador Friedman before he was confirmed, and he was pretty adamant that the first day at work was going to be living in his Jerusalem apartment, walking to the new embassy in Jerusalem. I'm happy to say that didn't take place, and the U.S. government decided just days ago that would be a very, very strategic mistake without other concrete moves towards a peace process, not towards accomplishing peace. And I think that we as a Jewish community, sometimes we're lacking clear voices, and I think we're sometimes still muting some of the voices that are coming from Jewish identity, raising the question of tikkun olam matters here and social justice matters here. Why can't we use that same Jewish value language when we talk about Israel? And when we talk about whether it's the Kotel or the conversion bill or the nation-state bill, the regularization bill, or the entry bill, and say, how is it that we expect the young generation in particular of Jews to feel like Israel isn't just the place of refuge, but a place that reflects my core values and our Jewish tradition's core values, and those can no longer be secondary concerns. I think they are every day raising real questions about whether the next generation can forge deep and lasting connections with the state of Israel. So I think that we have again, not 50 years to think about these questions. We have urgent questions that come up every day in the U.S. Congress, every day in the Knesset, and we also have a Supreme Court that's trying to address these. We also have a machloket l'shem shamayim with our rabbinic colleagues in Israel in terms of what are the ways in which the Jewish tradition is going to stand for Judaism that is serious about social justice, serious about learning, serious about peoplehood, and serious in a way that actually will preserve as opposed to divide us. So I hope the takeaways from today are not just I learned or I had some interesting moments where I agreed. Well, what are we going to do? And I think that JCPA obviously exists to do. I know the Reform Movement, Conservative Movement, Federations of North America, we exist to have a voice in shaping a more, not just a more inclusive public policy, but also to be able to advocate for the existential issues that have to do with Judaism and democracy, that have two states that are threatened now in the Democratic platform and already changed in the Republican platform. These are urgent questions that need our smart, compelling voices. I hope we'll continue that conversation.
It would be interesting to hear from both of you, what are the roles that Jewish institutions in North American life can play in helping all of us navigate these conversations, whether it's on a weekly basis within the walls of our synagogues, or even in the press? Is the press in the Jewish community dividing us in ways that the more secular press divides us now, where we're all reading silos that reflect our own thinking? What are the spaces where we can come together institutionally and otherwise?
that the first thing for coming together is a recognition that the other person may be right. We have come to view compromise and doubt as weaknesses. And you can't have democracy nor open debate if you can't embrace compromise and self-doubt. One of the things that worries me about talking Jewish values and bringing our morality into the public debate is that values are absolute. And political life is not. Political life is compromise between you and the other person you have a conflict with. And if you make it, I'm the good and they're the evil, then compromise with them becomes evil, and then the wars go on forever. The only way you can end a war or a conflict or a debate is by agreeing to meet somewhere in the middle where everybody gets something they need and gives up a lot that they wanted. And so the thing that we need to do is to train ourselves, train our children in doubt. Research now shows that the Palestinians who left Israel in 47 and 48, roughly, some were fleeing because they were urged. A far larger number were fleeing because there was a war going on, and they wanted to get out of the way. And a considerable number were kicked out. And I remember growing up and being taught the kicked out thing was a lie. It took me a lot of years to find out that actually it was true. And when kids think that Israel only does good and that the other side is at fault entirely for what goes wrong, then they come up against the arguments on campus and they don't have an answer. They discover that they didn't learn any real facts. We need not, the other thing that we need to do is to bifurcate the message. You have to learn how to doubt yourself, to listen to the other side, and then be willing to fight for yourself. Advocacy for Israel is not the same as learning about Israel. Learning about Israel is learning the good and the bad. It's also learning why the bad had to happen. That's hard for American Jews who don't like guns. I mean, the war in Vietnam is not a bad analogy. 6-Day War and the war in Vietnam. Well, in 67, I guess I was 17, I went to a rabbi, Gene Littman in Washington, for draft counseling. I wanted to be a conscientious objector. He said, if there were a war in Israel, like 66, I guess, if there were a war in Israel, would you go and fight? I said, of course. He said, you're not a conscientious objector, get out of here. But I find that many people my age and many people my kids' age, Jews, they have a hard time reconciling justice and the right, being right, and also handling a gun. And fighting in a war and being in an army. That the army can be the good guys. So the complexity of being both an advocate and a doubter, it's essential to be both. And it's very complicated and it's hard.
So I would say that the role of institutions is actually to, doubting is a good thing in developing ideas. I also think that we're all narrowcasting and that we read, whether it's Jewish journalism or regular journalism, or get our ideas from people who already agree with us. So I think that we lose a whole polarity that was actually very healthy within our Jewish tradition. It's been healthy in our Jewish community. I think right now we don't actually engage with people who are very different. That's one of the reasons I love that Danny Dayan was here today. When Danny Dayan was named to be the Consul General in New York, I have to say, I was speaking with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who told me, give him a chance. I said, why? I said, he's a partisan. He is a flamethrower. He's a person who is already very clearly aligned with a set of views. We need somebody in New York, frankly, who can represent the state of Israel to a diversity of individuals and communities. I have to say, at the end of the day, I'll be the first one to say Danny Dayan. Danny Dayan has actually been a very responsive Consul General. I think he's also today played the role of bringing a devar acher, some other views. And if we're not going to be debating with settlers, if we're not going to be discussing and debating within our Jewish community and with smart, thoughtful representatives of Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government and the American Jewish community, I think we lose the thread of the conversation. And I would just say that I hear over and over again from elected officials in Israel that all we have, particularly in America, but in North America in general, is an increasing disinterest and disaffection from Judaism and from Israel. And I think that the institutions, and I'll just speak for the Union for Reform Judaism and the Religious Action Center and ARZA and CCAR, I think we actually have a pretty strong, robust, and growing movement. And we actually care deeply about the state of Israel. We just care differently than many of the policies. So I think the institutions have a responsibility to plant a deeper love for the state of Israel than the headline, the crisis, the Knesset bill, the Supreme Court ruling. It's increasingly difficult to do that. But while we're sitting here, 250 shlichim are moving into their cabins at summer camps across North America of our movement to plant the love, not just the complexity, but that thing that just, ties your relationship to the state of Israel deeper than any particular government and roots it with the people, the values, the aspiration, and yes, the security. And I think the institutions actually have a role and frankly a responsibility, and I take that very seriously. I know my colleagues in Jewish community life do as well. And not that we speak for our North American Jewish community, but I think it's really important we have an Israeli government that almost to a fault doesn't really know North American Judaism or Jewish institutions well, and in many cases simply disrespects the authentic voices that we have. So I think we have to, use the institutions to do our public policy, but also to plant deeper seeds of relationship, love, and if we're in a machloket b'shem shamayim, we're arguing, but we're in a relationship, and I think that's something that I would love to encourage more, particularly among younger people, which is, if you don't like who's in the White House in the United States, that is an invitation. In fact, it's an imperative to lean in, get more involved, be more proactive. I think that is the same challenge and opportunity vis-a-vis Israel, which is not to disaffect, but raise your voice, raise it with others, and be a part of the debate that's raging.
That's actually something I was going to ask you about, which is, I don't want to make any assumptions, but looking around the room, I don't see a ton of millennials and under, and so how do we have these conversations with the people who are presently leading, will be leading in the years to come, and not have those voices on the outside, but bring them into the conversation as a central part of it?
First of all, I think that we're in the business of talking for millennials, or talking at millennials. I think it's a much more fruitful conversation as we talk with and listen to. I find that a lot of millennials have some pretty strong ideas about not only Israel, but Judaism and justice, and they want congruence in their lives of commitment. And so if they're going to be a progressive, here in North America, they want to know that there's a progressive, opportunity with the state of Israel. And I think the institutions, I'll just be really clear, I think some of the institutions we as a Jewish community have created are not serving our millennials. I think many of them, listen to the voices that speak on behalf of organized Jewry, and they say, where are our voices? Those don't reflect our views. So I think we have to invite in and frankly, not just let them listen, but I think we have to have a smarter conversation with millennials on a college campus. I think Rabbi Noah Satat said something earlier, I know it's a little controversial for some to hear, which is I think on a college campus a lot of times we have gladiators for Israel. I think we need people who are able to engage in deep conversation, but I think that sometimes we show up in those conversations and we throw gasoline on already, kind of simmering and uncomfortable things. I was at Vassar College a few months ago, And here you have at Vassar College a young undergraduate who, by himself, basically carried the flag against the BDS initiatives there. And, I think he's a progressive. He's very much connected to his Jewish community, to Jewish life. And I think that, and to say that millennials don't care about Israel is to say you're not talking to them. They do, but they can actually raise the question of the occupation. And when they hear a Jewish community, they won't even use the word occupation. I think it raises the question. And for me, 50 years, I also have the joy of Jerusalem's reunification. I'm part of organizations that are celebrating that and simultaneously addressing the pain of the occupation. If we fail to articulate that as Jewish communal leaders, we are, I think, very actively pushing millennials farther and farther from Jewish life. If we say, as some have said, that settlements have nothing to do with any peace process, they have nothing to do with the infrastructure for a future peace process, we are simply deluding ourselves. And I think young people have great antenna. They hear that, they turn off, and in many ways we lose our ability to be in deep dialogue. So I think let's listen and let's not discount because of the different voice.
One of the most successful Jewish organizations on campus and among millennials right now is something called Jewish Voice for Peace. They are basically anathema. The communities around the country are still struggling to admit J Street, which is essentially the American voice of the Israeli Labor Party, the left half, not the far left, the left half of the Israeli body politic. And Jewish Voice for Peace, many of them don't like Israel. They have an anger in them. And when you talk to somebody who really doesn't like Israel, they're shocked. I mean, I've had many conversations with Palestinians who, how can you call yourself a Zionist? How can you like Israel? It expels people, it depresses people. You're having as hard a time listening to me as so many of my people have listening to you. But when we exclude an organization, Jewish Voice for Peace is an evidence that there is a vast population of millennials who do care about Israel. Not the way I care about Israel, not the way I'd like my kids to care about Israel, but Israel is something that's important in their lives, right now in a negative way. And there's nothing being done to help them translate that into a critical love, rather than a critical dislike. When you exclude people from the community, the end result is you exclude people from the community. The flip side is, and I don't hear a whole lot of this anywhere I go, one of the teachers that I have, my sister-in-law lives in Hebron. She's one of the first settlers there. She's raised 10 kids there. And we're close. I mean, we go there when we visit Israel, which is pretty much every year, a few times a year. It is true, as Donnie said, that those hills, the West Bank is essentially a mountain range that runs north and south through the Galilee, through Lebanon. Those hills are where the prophets walked. Tekoa, where Amos, the prophet Amos walked. Beit El, which was the first, Shiloh was the first tabernacle, right? Hebron was the first land that Abraham bought in the land of Israel. It's the beginning of the Jewish presence in the land of Israel. It has to hurt to tell people they have to leave, that they can't live there. There are important practical reasons, humanitarian reasons, security reasons, why you have to separate the Jewish population and the Palestinian population. Not because there is a possibility of love tomorrow, but because they don't like each other. Every time I write another column saying Israel's got to get out of the territories, I remember that I'm telling the Israeli army to kick my sister-in-law and her 10 kids out of their house. And it's important. It's an important feeling to remember that I'm calling for pain for somebody else. They're there for the wrong, well, they're not there for the wrong reasons. They're there because they want to be close to the spiritual source of Judaism. We got to compromise, but we have to recognize that there are reasons. There are reasons why the Palestinians are mad at us. There are reasons why the settlers want to be there, and you can't create dialogue between them or yourself in either side, if you can't listen and understand and sympathize, empathize with the thing you don't like.
Okay, so we're almost at time, but I want to get in one or two questions from the audience. So, anyone have a question for our panelists? Just raise your hand. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jessica Brown. I'm with J Street. Earlier this morning there was statistics about the degree of racism among young Israelis, both Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. And I'm wondering, do we believe those statistics, and how do we react to that? Because it's frightening to think that racism is really that common among young Israelis.
Thank you. Let's hold that for 1 second, see if there's one other question. We'll take them all together. Yes, stand up so we can hear you.
Thank you. My name is Zachary. I'm a few years out of college. I was curious about one of the comments you would make that you think JVP is one of the most successful Israel organizations, Jewish organizations on campus. I'm just curious, in my experience as a professional who works on campuses and someone who was recently on campus, I haven't really seen that. As far as I've seen, it's a very low number of students involved. I was just curious why you thought that.
Thank you.
So I can try the first question. Second question, I actually think I agree with you. I think it was a small number. I don't think that was necessarily a quantitative response. And I think that there are a whole lot of progressives on college campuses who are not aligned with, with any of the organizations, and I think are trying to find, is there a place that reflects their spiritual and moral questions. So I think the question of racism, I'm actually quite discomforted by the notion that some of those within the Jewish community are fed by rabbinic leaders and by readings of Jewish texts. I think of Shmuel Eliyahu, he was for many years has been the chief rabbi of Sfat, has basically a rap sheet of racist views about Arabs. It's the size of a New York City telephone book, if we ever have telephone books anymore, and was being considered to be the chief rabbi of the state of Israel and the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. I think there is an underbelly of racist views. I think that the price tag attacks reflect that. And I think that, for me, the biggest question, can the Jewish tradition be
in all of the bills, the anti-Semitic language that comes out of imams, preachers, on the Palestinian Authority payroll? Well, there are rabbis on the Israeli government payroll who do that sort of thing too. Shmuel Eliyahu was one. That book that came out about 10, 15 years ago about the legitimacy of killing Gentile Arab children so they don't grow up to be terrorists. Maimonides, Rambam. There was a discussion about, I'm sorry?
I don't think that's fair.
What's not fair?
It's not fair that you're taking a rap and comparing it to the breadth of all of the hatred that's pouring out against Jewish people from a large number of demons.
I understand what you're saying.
So you got to be careful.
I'm trying to be careful, and I don't know that you're aware of how much of that stuff comes out of the Orthodox community in Israel. My mind, Rambam, enters the discussion about whether it's, he who saves one life is as though he saved the whole world. But it is clear in the Talmud that they're talking about a Jewish life. Can you violate Shabbat to save a non-Jewish life? There's a lively debate in the Talmud, and Rambam comes up with the final answer, which is, you may not be commanded to save a non-Jewish life because you can't violate Shabbat to save a life that isn't Jewish, but because of the way it makes Jews look. If you don't, therefore you must save a non-Jewish life. Now, that's part of the Jewish tradition too. That's deeply baked into our culture. The Torah says quite explicitly, man shall not lie with man. That's part of our tradition. So we need to struggle bringing Jewish values to the pulpit. Let's remember that there's a range of Jewish values. And that there are Jews that we profoundly don't agree with. Now, one of the things when I talk about there's hatred that comes from somebody did something to you. Attitudes toward Arabs among young Israelis are becoming hardened because of the continual terrorism. So that there is a reason why each year the polls show young Jews in Israel becoming more and more hostile to Arabs. And I suppose there's a reason why we hear more and more on the Palestinian side. The longer the conflict goes on, the longer people wait for... I mean, one of the things we heard today was until they learn to accept and embrace our right to have a Jewish state in the land of Israel, nothing's going to happen. They're never going to accept that. The idea that we had a right to have a Jewish state, that is asking them to admit that all of these years they were wrong. We should be grateful that they admit they lost. And that they recognize Israel as a country that can define itself. But to expect that, the notion that you're going to keep on hitting somebody over the head until they tell you they love you. The longer you held on, the longer the deeper the hatred grows.
It is more than clear that we can continue this conversation for quite a long time to come. Let us go forward with strength, with commitment, with love. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Thank you to J.J. Goldberg, Rabbi.